Welcome to Connections, bringing together King's Business School's sharpest minds with first-hand insight from leaders in the world of business, public service, science and beyond.
Welcome to the King's Business School Connections podcast from the Economic Equality Impact Group. I am Dr. Ylva Baeckstrom from King's Business School. I'm here with James Penny, Managing Director and Head of the UK International Private Bank at Barclays, and Martin Gronemann, who heads up practice in financial services for Red Associates. Red is a consulting firm that uses human science to put people back at the center of business decision-making. Today, we, two middle-class white men and a white woman, spot the flaw with that setup, are here to talk about diversity in financial services with a specific focus on gender and financial advice. Welcome, Martin, and welcome, James.
Thanks a lot, Ylva. Happy to be part of this discussion. Looking forward to it.
Good morning, Ylva, and good morning, Martin. Also delighted to be joining you.
Thank you very much, both of you. If you don't mind, I'll kick off with asking some questions, and indeed, if you want to pitch in with something different to what I'm asking you, you're more than welcome to. I think it's important for us to role model that it's not just one set way forward, and we get there with collective decision making in a collaborative manner. So, as we've already established, we might have a problem with the demographic mix of the three of us in the group today hosting this podcast, but we'll get started anyway because this is a really important discussion that needs to be had. I was wondering, firstly, if I can maybe put this to you, James. Can you tell me if you believe that gender is an important focus area for your business, and if so, why?
Of course, it's an important area for us. At its most basic, the business that I run, that I work for, is serving the population at large with a broadly 50-50 split in the gender of our clients. So having a workforce that looks something similar to that is a great start. But if you take a step back and you look a little more broadly at that, great gender diversity tends to lead to great business, and there are all the benefits that you'll be very familiar with. So you have better staff retention, you have better productivity, you have better recruitment or easier recruitment. Probably for a bank, most importantly, better decision making, and I think that you have better risk management as well with gender diverse teams, committees, boards. My observation: talented individuals go to places that do gender diversity well, and it's a people business. You need to have the best people on your team.
Thank you, James. Martin, do you have any reflections on this?
Yeah, I would think about it both in terms of like being a consultancy. Of course, there's the client dimension and like the internal dimension of that. I think fundamentally, our experience is it's good business to get people right. If you know what matters to them and you know what the critical things to solve for are, you can build better products, better services, and have a better business. And in that way, there's no difference. It's good business to get people right. It's good business to get gender right. And I think we've seen plenty of examples over the years in finance and beyond on good attempts at doing that, but also a lot of failed attempts to do that. Maybe we can also talk about some of those later. But that, for example, has been the idea that, of course, women in financial services is an emerging segment, a customer group you want to cater for, but maybe inviting them in for a launch and screening of Bridget Jones' Diary with pink champagne might not be the right way of actually, having a serious conversation about money. So I think we've seen a lot of stereotypical ways of trying to solve this issue and address this issue, and they rarely work. So it's good business to get gender right for our clients. That's why it's important, but also for our own practice. Back to what James said, it's a vital, if you want to have great talent and you want to have high quality practice and you want it to be an interesting place to work, diversity is better.
You've both spoken about how increasing gender diversity in your organizations is good business, both in terms of recruiting clients, for profitability within the firm, risk management, and other aspects. But what about the wider society, going beyond the wealthier set of clients that you might encounter in your business? Where do we sit with that? What should we be doing?
I think that looking at that question more broadly, it is a key. It's a key area for all large financial service providers because the broader the audience that you're talking to, the broader your future business will become. I think that technology, I'm sure, will come up many times in what we're going to talk about and touch upon this morning. And I think that I certainly look more broadly than our developed business in a developed country and look towards the revolution that's happening within the fintech world and the great strides that some companies but broadly some countries have managed to achieve in developing economies. And if you look, if you look to Asia, the big successes have been in India, they've been in China, but they've been in places like South America as well, where the combination of technology into apps that cut straight across the world of finance and look at making a payment, for example. If you look at how that has changed, and if you look to somewhere like India or China, where you've seen such massive strides in terms of people don't use cash anymore, people use an app on their phone, and these are not wealthy people by any stretch of the imagination. I travel in Africa quite broadly, and you will be amazed at the technology and use of mobile phone apps in places that are a long way from being in a modern city. So I think that technology's got something to play definitely in terms of inclusion, and I think that's probably the big winner. If you get your technology, if you get your apps, your development right, it looks and feels right, it appeals to a broader audience, then that probably is going to be the way forward.
So really about making the financial services that people need accessible to everyone through the help of technology.
Exactly, and it's unlikely to be in kind of bricks and mortar moving forward. And probably if you're talking about the mass market, then it has to be technology.
Thank you, Martin. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and thanks for asking the question, and also make sure we cover all the aspects of what this touches upon. I would say typically the way we work is to look for those deeper problems to solve for, where I would say, even though there can be a commercial argument for a client to push for it, I would say in close to all our projects that have also led to helping clients make better decisions, and not just in private banking, also let's say lower middle class pension retirement and products like those, where it is pretty vital, especially when you have populations, let's say more female, that typically wouldn't save up enough for their pension, that you do nudge and help people to set up more aside for that. So I think in general, I think we've seen that. One of the things that we've seen very clearly, I would say the last year across practice areas and geographies have been that there is a very clear growing expectation that commercial companies contribute to society. And I think it was a very clear movement that was prior to COVID. I think we've all seen that with World Economic Forum and those kind of debates that were already there. It's clear in our work that has simply just grown the past year and a half. And in the way we advise and work with our clients is increasing to say there is not a thing called commercial and one thing called societal. You need to think them more we advise you to think about them more intertwined. And a good example of that would be if you take a lot of these CSR areas like kids and money, you take inequality, you take gender, and you can go on. Typically, most banks would do something on them. Typically, it would be disconnected from the core customer experience. Typically, it's not something the ordinary person in the country would know. And typically, it's not something that really moves the needle on the issue. That, I would say, goes for at least close to all the banks I've ever met. And I think what we're seeing is that it might be advisable to start thinking a little bit differently about that. That if you are a bank and you do advise people and you do meet them, that think more clearly and explicitly and ambitiously about what you do in your core task, let's say advise people, short-term, long-term, looking at the societal opportunities and effects that you could contribute to. So if you take inequality, let's say in this widest form, I think that a clear move would be when it comes to gender to say, one thing is to have an experience where you don't have explicit biases and where you target some of those unconscious biases, whether it's digital or not. Think about how do we make sure to talk with our clients about the issues that we know are generating inequality. Let's say a thing like paternity leave, maternity leave, and how decisions around that impact contributions to pension, but also who gets back to the labor market. It seems like such a natural, predictable, structured thing to bake into an advisory concept. Yet, at least personally, I've yet to see that. But looking broader than that and touch upon about inclusion and accessibility, I think there it really also lies in the execution of it, because there's no doubt, like James talked about, I see the same thing, that if you really want to help people, more people, benefit from the advisory services for finance, it's about getting more people access to the equity and the kind of financial products that also create returns that most people don't have access to in a responsible way. That probably needs to be scalable and low cost, probably needs to be digital. Yet, how do we then make sure we don't get into a situation like Robinhood, where we take all of those good ideas about gamification, put them into a retail platform in terms of driving engagement? Because that is not necessarily how we drive healthy behavior. But if we are to solve for the issue of inequality and address that, it's probably better, I would suggest, to think about how do we have nudges and behavior adjustments in that helps people make better decisions. And that's not about webinars, that's not about videos, and it's not about click this big green button. That's more thinking about where people at, what's the next decision they should make, and how do you make it interesting and motivating to do that. And I feel in those areas, I'm really keen to see industry leaders pick up the mantle on those ones.
It's interesting what you say there, and unconscious bias in advice. I was just thinking about whether you could digitally completely eradicate that, because I'm sure it exists. And Ylva, I know you've done some work on this. But if you do go down that route, I mean, you're following effectively a tree diagram, and I think that it should be able to. I think you can probably get to a position where it's a lot better than it is today, going down the digital route and the robo advice, if you want to call it that. Because at the moment, I'm not aware of any organisations that will be checking the advice that is given for anything other than it being the correct advice in the conventional sense. Is the product right for the client's risk profile and all the other metrics that you use? But there is not a screen that sits over and above that, which says, and was there bias in that advice? So I think it's a really interesting way forward. It will lead to undoubtedly to better advice, which is a win-win solution for the providers and obviously for the customers that are buying that product.
To me, it's almost like, I think if you should look at the gold standard of what the thousands of people I and my team have met the past 15 years, it would be that there's some kind of data-driven structure that doesn't just depends on what products do you like or what have you heard about recently or which of the 50 products do you know better than the others. But some kind of structure to guide it, but also with some kind of human overlay, because as a sociologist, I would say finance is still a pretty technical world. It's a language and a product space that most people don't know how to navigate. So the idea that somebody can also, build a bridge and help with the translation in few situations is still great. But when it then comes to what you said, which is if you want to make that scalable to everyone and we have constraints on resources, you can imagine that you do something that's more digital or something that's more automated that would be better for more, given what the alternative is. So I could almost imagine to think about it, maybe there's more of a gold standard when you have more resources. This is what you can do, maybe also in a commercial context, but maybe something that is substantially better than what is out there today, but a little bit more scalable in its nature. Like in Denmark, we, for example, have, I don't know if it's the same in UK, for example, but regardless of who you are, how much money you have, if you work, let's say in the public sector, you have a pretty high amount of your salary that goes to pension that is mandatorily invested. You can't decide not to have it invested. And that means, that, for example, is one way where people of, let's say, lower middle income get their money invested far better than they would if they had to do it themselves and get the benefit of financial experts in the pension provider. And I think it could be interesting or fun to think about, A, how do you do that more, but also B, how could you do that to other people's money? Are there other mechanisms to kind of make it more mandatory or natural to get more expert advice? And does it have to be purely commercial? Could it also be a mix between, let's say, public and private institutions, or even partnerships between banks to do that? Strikes me as an interesting area.
Thank you both. It's really insightful. I mean, those of you who are a little familiar with my research know that I have this thing about talking about finance as having a male biological sex, in terms that it was created by men originally, and then through exclusion of the other gender, or other genders, I should say, until the mid-1970s, it developed a very rigid male gender as well. Now, when you talk about unconscious bias, it's a really big area, and it's very hard even to define unconscious bias sometimes, I think, and it's a term that's thrown around quite a lot. But when you think about developing technology and developing new tools and new products within finance, I think we need to be mindful of who develops them. So generally, technology is developed in majority by men, which means that we will continue the male gendered language in the development of new tools. I would also argue that when the risk categories were defined, and I'm not sure how they are at Barclays, James, but quite often a person who likes to have high returns and can afford to take a greater amount of risks than some other people for whatever reason is called aggressive. I would argue that a woman wouldn't have come up with that terminology, should have been designed differently. So how do we then, now going into that unconscious bias discussion that is so difficult, how do we make sure that when we build new products, new marketing materials, new technology, that we are trying to make accessible to the wider public, that we avoid the unconscious bias that is implicit in the industry?
It's an interesting question, and yes, I mean, you're absolutely right in that word aggressive, and there's a number of other words that you could use. They do crop up. Look, I think that there's a kind of short-term and a long-term answer to that. The long-term is that you don't just have men working in finance. You know, it comes down to the gender gap that you have at the moment in terms of employees. The industry is making, I think, reasonable progress, albeit slow. And if you look, you know, I can certainly speak for Barclays that you've now got probably, 26, 27% across the group of senior positions at kind of director and managing director filled by females, probably higher than that in the UK, pushing 30%. So I think the progress is being made, and at some point in the future, hopefully we won't be talking about this, because all of the departments, you know, the teams that build the products, the teams that build the tech behind it, the teams that do the risk profiling, it's gender split in a neutral way, and we don't have that discussion. Having that gender mix gives you better decisions, and that's not just the kind of risk decisions. Do we lend to this person or do we not lend to this person? It's the discussion around how those profiles are built up, which attributes you use, which are important, and taking a step back and says, does this apply equally to our male and to our female clients? So I'm hoping that kind of is the future. In the shorter term, you perhaps have to force that issue, and the research that you're doing, your decision-making process, if the right people are not sitting at the table, then you either have to consult or go out, use consultants to do that. You make sure that your research is appropriate, or you bring other people into that decision-making process. But importantly, you don't forget to do that job. Having that kind of gender mix at the forefront of your mind, rather like you did, Ylva, at the top of this call, by just pointing out the fact that having a conversation about gender with two white middle-class males is not perhaps hugely representative, and that's something that we all have to remember in all aspects of our working lives. The people in the room are not necessarily representative of your client population.
There's no doubt that default experience at most banks is more off-putting to most women than to most men. But I would say one thing, which is, if you pick the word, you said aggressive, and like we look out and like the language, the jargon, the assumptions, the style and tone of engagement that I generally see, I would say it's off-putting to 80% of men as well, myself included. The first thing that we have seen has been that oftentimes a lot of those semantics, language, and so on are built on a relatively rudimentary or bad insight into what actually matters to people and how do they want to be approached and talked to in general. To address your question about unconscious biases and also address maybe the question of the experience being off-putting to many, I think in our experience it has been that if it's built on a deep scientific understanding about what actually matters to people, a lot of that will be addressed simply because you would know who people are and what matters to them, regardless of gender, race, age, line of work, and so on. I think the other thing, though, is the reason that in our research, it does hit harder on women than men, what it is now, is luckily tried a little bit to overcome my own biases by teaming up with my CST practice that are largely occupied by my female colleagues beforehand. So also seeking their advice also on things to say and not to say in this podcast. But I think what they told me also is the research they've done in North America and our practice over there have shown that more men than women are likely to make decisions not based on full information, but the confidence that it might be right. Whereas there's a greater threshold for a lot of the female respondents we've seen to more wanting to have the capability and knowing if things are okay and scrutinize a bit more what is behind it and what's the logic. And I think that makes super good sense to make a good decision. It just means that the jargon and the way of interacting in the system today just means it takes a little bit longer or harder to get there, which I think in our research to, I guess, build on and both supplement what you've done, Ylva, which is of course more extensive, is just to say that the way that dominant experience is off-putting to most, but is more off-putting to most women than it is to most men, at least in terms of what we have seen. And then the last thing about the data-driven advice, I think I very much agree with you, James, that it needs to be more data-driven in a way, and that is a very helpful way of also taking out a lot of the biases. And then just make sure that it doesn't become like some of those bad examples about mortgage lending approvals that we've seen, especially in the US, where it's blind training algorithms on past data that repeats the unconscious biases that were baked into the behavior that led to the prior decision. So some kind of, critical analysis, critical investigation to whatever, those algorithms will be unleashed to is probably also could be helpful potentially.
Thank you both. There's so many things I'd like to pick up on there, James. I think what you said really is that a lot of the problems can be solved by just creating a really diverse workforce who become the creators of the new products, the creators of new technology, and that will ensure that it becomes gender neutral rather than male or female. And Martin, I love that you picked me up on the fact that I said that it was created by men for men. Of course, it's not palatable for all men because it's kind of an alpha male language we're talking about. And most men don't fit into that alpha male category and do not wish to be in that category either. And really, it's about gender neutralizing rather than making it female gendered, so that it's available for everyone regardless of what gender they associate themselves with. And I think that's really important. I'm glad you brought that up. I think it's so linked to the financial exclusion that has been awarded to women or not awarded, however we want to put that, to women over the years, and it's a relatively new domain therefore. And therefore you have more unstable preferences, and that makes that you tend to make more investigations into something to increase your knowledge before you make a decision. And that can sometimes come across as a lack of confidence. And indeed, it probably is a lack of confidence, but it certainly isn't a lack of competence. Competence is the opposite. You become better informed, so you make better decisions. But what you do, and James, you see this in your business all the time, I'm sure, is that you'll ask more questions and you'll ask for more information, and it takes longer then to sell to the person that's less confident. Would you agree with that, James?
I would agree 100%. I've spent 30-something years in advising clients, and my observation is that there is actually not much difference in competence between male clients and female clients. And I think broadly, again, going back to an earlier point that we made about what can we do about financial inclusion more, there's a huge role for education in that. And I can, I work all over the world. I don't think that there's any one country that I could recall where I've thought, yeah, it's done brilliantly and everyone is better informed. So I think that we need to do a better job from very small kids right all the way through people's education to give them the building blocks that they will need to make responsible decisions as an adult. But that aside, when you come back to advice, so I think that the base knowledge for male and female clients that I've seen is broadly not that different. But you're absolutely right in that the men will bluff it out. And you will have a very different conversation unless you are careful with a male and a female client. Yes, generalizing hugely, the females will ask more questions and it will be a longer process. But I would push back and say, actually, there's much more risk in misadvising a male client who bluffs it out and doesn't fully understand the decisions that they're making on the basis of their confidence, if you want to call it that they'll probably get it right and it'll probably be okay in the long run because the advisor knows what they're speaking about. Part of the regulatory framework in most countries demands that the client that is opposite you understands what they're doing before they actually sign up for whatever is being provided to them. So I think the really good advisors will be forcing the men to take a step back and probably moving, as you said, towards that middle ground of a gender neutral kind of solution. But I think it's probably, if you're doing your job properly, it is gender neutral with a tinge of pink, if I can put it that way, because that's the way that I would like to be providing advice to clients, to fully inform them about all aspects of the decision that they're about to make. So I think if you do it properly, it's more difficult with men because they don't particularly want to hear everything that you want to tell them.
Thank you for listening to the first part of our podcast on gender and financial advice. In our next episode, we're going to be talking about the key skills that a financial advisor needs or needs to leave behind to be successful in today's marketplace. How can we bring empathy into financial advice and what makes a great banker? See you then.
Thanks for listening to Connections. Subscribe for more insights into the issues shaping business, the economy, and society.